Hello and welcome to today's class on understanding geography with diagrams. See, today we'll be talking about the population problem. Now, let us read the first statement. The first statement says that the population problem vary in space and time, or we can say the population problem varies spatially and temporally, and can be analyzed in the context of developed and developing nations separately. Now, what are the population problems of the developing country? Please pay attention. First, it says that overpopulation. Obviously, we know about the overpopulation. Second, it talks about the unemployment. Again, unemployment is because of the overpopulation. Again, we have the poor standard of living and malnutrition. Again, one of the reasons is overpopulation. Last but not the least, it's again management of the mismanagement of the agriculture resources, and again one of the biggest problem that or the twin problem that developing nation faces, that is both overpopulation and underpopulation. Overpopulated country can be classified into India, China, etc. Now, underpopulation country is again we have the context of the Latin America. You have also the Brazil, which is also called as the underpopulated nation. We have studied about Brazil in our topic of optimum population, and that how Brazil lacks the adequate population necessary to harness its resource. So from this we got that the developing countries have two problems, that is one of the overpopulation and also that of the underpopulation. Now, what is the problem with the developed nation? Now, the one of the biggest problems of the developed nation is underpopulation. What is underpopulation means? They do not have the necessary population, or they lack the population is below the optimum level. That is the simple definition that we can provide for the for underpopulation. Now, now if you are having underpopulation, then obviously we'll be having a small labor force. Again, the long lifespan. What is this long lifespan? It means that the people over there live a healthy life and a long life. Now, if you are having a long lifespan, then obviously what will happen is that the elderly population would be more. And the elderly population, if the elderly population is more, what will happen is that your social welfare measures has to be taken to at least sustain this elderly population. On the other hand, the elderly population, they rarely work and they are more dependent. So that is major problem. We'll talk more about it while we study the European case study. Next, shortage of rural workforce. This is one of the major thing in the rural areas, especially in the agriculture sector. What happens is that these developed nations, they actually lack the workforce that is necessary to sustain their agriculture, economy. Next, Europe case study. Now, what is happening in Europe? First thing that is happening in Europe is the declining fertility rate. The statement says that none of the European country except Albania, Bosnia, and Latvia at present is replacing its population through the natural increase. Means except these three countries, the rest European countries are not replacing its population in a natural through natural increase. We can simply say that the population or the fertility rate is below the replacement level. Next, increase in the elderly population. Again, example is that of Germany. It says that the Germany has the oldest population in the world, with small proportion of the young, that is 13%, and a large share of middle age, that is 66%, and 21% retired people over the age of 65. Now, if you look at this elderly population, then I want you to look at over here over this statement which says that the burden on the government exchequer, as they see, basically what happens is that as they shall have to provide pension and other social services to the citizens who are more than 65 years of age. Already in Germany, there are 4 pensioners for every 10 workers, and it is predicted that by 2025 the number of pensioners will be half to that of the number of workers. These are the things that you must understand. What are the basically the biggest demerit of longevity? Yes, what is this longevity? Longevity means nothing but your long lifespan. Again, what else is the problem? The biggest problem over here is the shutting down of the educational institutions. In Europe, what is happening is that you basically the kindergarten, nurseries, and the schools are being closed down because they do not have the young population to sustain it. Hence, there is demand has been reduced, And above all, we have the worker shortage, which is being faced by Germany, France, and Belgium. Now, this is the basic thing, that what is the population problem across the world. Now, let us study about the population policies. Now, the population policy to regulate the population growth can be divided into two phases. One is the antinatalist and one is the pronatalist. What is antinatalist? Antinatalist means we are against the population growth. Pronatalist means we are in favor of the population growth. Now, let us study the population discouraging or the antinatalist policy. Now, this population discouraging or the antinatalist policy are mostly adopted by the developing countries such as the India, China, etc. The policy mostly are in the form of the preventive checks. I hope you understand the term preventive checks was utilized by Malthus while describing how the population can be controlled. And such an increasing age, such as, yes, what were these preventive checks? Such as increasing the age of the marriage. This also include economic incentives for the small families in the republic, such as it has been given in the Republic of the South Korea, and financial reward for sterilization in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, preferential treatment for the mothers of the small family, such as in Singapore, free abortion facility in the Tunisia, Cuba, and legalization of abortion. See, if you can write all these points, the highlighted points with minimum or the minimum examples, it's fine. No need to remember all examples. Next, supplying contraceptives and information with respect to the benefits of the small family. Simple. Now let us analysis of the anti-natalist policies across the world. The anti-natalist policies across the world can be divided into three phases. First is the KAP, that is nothing but the knowledge application practice. Then we are going to look into the Indian antinatalism, and we'll also talk about the Chinese antinatalism. See, the knowledge application practice. This was initiated by the United Nations in the year 1950. What was all this about? The objective of this was that let us implement the knowledge that has been gained by the developed nation. This developed nations such as the Europe and other nations, they had started that population policy way back. Hence, their population was stable that time. And on the other hand, countries such as the India, China, they had overpopulation. Hence, this program of the KAP, that is Knowledge Application Practice, initiated by UN of 1950, what its basic objective was, now let's implement the knowledge that has been developed by the developed nations in controlling the population of your developing and least developed nation. But what happened was that this thing actually failed. What was the reasons? First is that it lacked the practicality in academics. First of all, it lacked practicality, that is, it was morely academic. Means they completely lacked its practicality. There was nothing that there was no concrete over there. Next, absence of specific target means at what time should we control the policies, at what time we should control the population. Sorry for that. At what time we should control and at what rate we should control. This was something missing in this KAP initiative. Last but not the least, lack of trust that prevailed among the newly independent countries against the ex-colonial nation. See, by the time of 1950s, you must remember that most countries, including India and other nations, had gained their freedom. And during this point of time, what happened was that they were not very much satisfied with the knowledge or the very much initiatives of the developed nations, because they obviously knew that these are colonial nations, and there was a lack of trust between this nation. Example you can see is the Mao policy of high population. Mao adopted this high population policy because according to Mao, the greater the number of population, greater will be your strength. This was Mao's philosophy. Hence, the China, what it started was that in the very beginning, China said that let us grow our population and let's be the largest population nation of the world, until and unless China faced the biggest hurdle over there and started with the one child policy. Let's let's look into the India's antinatalism. Now, India is the second most populous country in the world. India marked the beginning of the explicitly national population policy oriented towards controlling the birth way back in 1952. With the independence in 1947, we initiated our population policy way back in 1952. India's natalism or antinatalism incorporated very well defined temporal phase. What is temporal phase? Nothing but your time phase. Or you can see, this is basically for your understanding. If you want to write a introduction to it, you can simply see that the Indian antinatalism or the Indian policies or the population policies to control the population can be divided into three phases, that is your voluntary, family welfare and the contemporary phase. Simple definition can also do. No need to write such complicated definition. Now, the first phase of the voluntary policy. The first phase, see, the phase itself, this phase of the antinatalist policy is called the voluntary policy. Voluntary policy means that people who are the main who would be the main implementer of this policy would have the choice whether they want to implement this or they don't want to implement this. There would be no forceful implementation of any policy. Now, the first phase or the voluntary phase of the Indian antinatalism remained prevalent between 1950 to 1972. So this is the time period within which our this policy remained prevalent. Now, this phase of antinatalism is recognized to be absolute example of the voluntary phase, implement on the ground of absolute choice of the recipient. What is the absolute choice? Means the people, they had the choice whether you want to have this policy or whether you don't want to have this policy, whether you want to implement this or you don't want to implement this. Now, what were the elements of this policy? The first element was the informative clause. What is this informative clause? Informative clause means, it simply means that we were providing information to the people. Hum do, hamare do. This was nothing but the government's that time propaganda that we should not have more than 2 children. This was something, and that this informative clause not just had such kind of propaganda, but also it informed them that what are the advantages of having a small family and what are the disadvantages of having a large family. Next, the benefits, yes, this is what it totally discussed. That is, informing the individual about the benefits of a small family and the possible ways of controlling the size of the family. Simple. Next, second point, this phase of antinatalism also involved the development of the health service network as the fundamental infrastructure which was required for the successful population policy. See, this was also during the time when we focused upon the healthcare service, such as developing our primary healthcare center and the tertiary healthcare center, so that abortions can be facilitated and also sterilizations can be facilitated. Now, what actually happened? Now, what was the outcome of this phase? Nearly 20 years of the implementation, statistically, this phase of antinatalism proved to be a failure. That is, it failed, with India touching highest growth rate of population, approximately 20%. The growth rate was 24% as per the 1971 census, which corresponds to the population explosion. So it was in the 1971 census, what we found was that this led to the population explosion. Next, this was experienced in the country in the 71, as per the 71 data table released by the Indian National 71 data table was released. Hence, with this, what happened, that the Indian antinatalism was molded into the second phase, or we can say, with this, the second phase began. What was the second phase? Second phase was nothing but your family welfare phase. What is this family welfare phase? The family welfare phase is based on the realization that in a democratic setup, voluntary clause of implementation of policy cannot be molded, and that if parents are assured of the healthy survival of the kids, they will adapt to the small family norm. Please understand this. In this family welfare phase, first of all, we realized that voluntary clause was not enough. We realized that why, first of all, we understood that why the family, they are reproducing more and more children. See, the basic problem during this phase, during the 1971, was that there was prevalence of epidemics. There was prevalence of other diseases, as a result of which the chances of the survival of a child was very, very low. Hence, what the parents did was that they actually reproduced with a higher number of children, so that at least some of the children could survive. This was the basic mentality or the basic perception that prevailed during this time. Hence, government realized this. So government started its immunization program way back over here in 1971. So what did government say that key? Government said that key, let us assure the people that if your child is born, your child would be safe and he or she will not die of this particular disease. Hence, with this, we started our program. We started with the pulse polio program. We started with the DPT, that is your diphtheria, pertussis, tuberculosis, every kind of the vaccine was introduced during this time, and the government started this vaccination at a large scale. Now, what happened in this family welfare phase? The family planning was made the family welfare in this country. In this phase of the antinatalism, pre and postnatal healthcare services was developed. What is prenatal means before birth. What is postnatal means after birth. Before birth healthcare services and after birth healthcare services was strongly enlarged, and there was the beginning of the countrywide immunization program. Two things happened. We further pushed our healthcare services, we further developed our healthcare services, number one. And number two, immunization program was also at a rampant stage, or the immunization program was started at a very greater stage or in a very big manner. Now, this phase of the antinatalism readily marked the success in 1981 census, which is referred to as the watershed census year. Remember that we have two watershed census year. One is your 1921 and other is your 1981. 1921 was post pre-independence and 1981 was the post-independence. Now, what is this watershed census? Means India entered into the third stage of demographic transition. I hope you remember that in the third stage of demographic transition, the gap between the fertility and the mortality was very, very large. That is, begin in the decline of the fertility rate. This success, however, was simultaneous to the realization of the regional disparity prevailing in the country. What is this regional disparity? Now let's see. Let us use the diagram to understand this. Basically, I have drawn this India map. Now what happened was that this family welfare phase actually showed its success in the southern provinces. Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, they responded readily, even some parts of the Maharashtra. This population responded readily. But what was the problem? The problem was with the Hindi heartland. What is this Hindi heartland? The entire area which is stretched from your Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh. Now, what happened was that this was also called as the Bimaru state. Now, this state they did not responded so well to the program. Rather, what happened was that the population increased over there, but population decrease was witnessed in the southern peninsula state. Now, let's understand the statement. India's demographic transition as a growth with stability evolved as an absolute divide between the peninsular and the extra peninsular. What is this extra peninsular? Extra peninsular is nothing but this part of India. This is your extra peninsular part. This is your peninsular and this is your extra peninsular. There was a divide between the peninsular and the extra peninsular part. Most of the peninsular states readily responded to the family welfare antinatalism, as we had explained in the diagram. But the Bimaro state, mainly including the Hindi heartland, it failed to generate the desired transition. It failed to generate the desired transition. Because why? Number one was that the poor societal status of the female. The female had a poor societal status. This is number one. Number two, lack of education and widespread misconception. Third, strong desire for the male child because of the dominance of a patriarchal society over there. And this formed the major point of the realization of the non response. Now, taking this into account, in the year 2000, India introduced the contemporary phase of population policy. Now, what did we do in this contemporary phase? In this contemporary phase, first of all, we continued with the old phase. First, our voluntary clause again continued. Second, family welfare clause also continued, that is immunization and strengthening of your healthcare system. And last but not the least, What was added was that education of the girl and women empowerment as an additional clause. That education of the girl and women empowerment was added as another clause in the contemporary phase of the population policy. This contemporary phase represents its success with the fact that census decade, that is 2001 to 2011, is the only census decade that marked the beginning of the participation of the EAG. What is this EAG state? EAG state is nothing but your empowered action group state. What are this empowered action group states? Same Hindi heartland states that we called as the Bimaro are now called as the EAG, that is the Empowered Action Group States. They started registering, that is, they registered begin and the decline in the fertility rate. The contemporary phase was also include the initiation of the clause of appeasement. What is this clause of appeasement? What do you mean by basically the term appeasement? Appeasement means that basically requesting people to do something. This involved medical insurance to the couples below the poverty line. That is, if you are having if you are having two children or less than two children, then the government was providing medical insurance to them, especially to the couples below the poverty line with two children, along with recognition of the provision of award from the PRI, Panchayati Raj. They were awarding that if you are having less population, again you are receiving an award from the Panchayati Raj. Next, India's antinatalism in all its dimensions justifies to be the example of slow but steadily successful antinatalist country. See, if you have understood this contemporary phase and if you understood this family welfare phase, then understand that India is today is witnessing a demographic dividend. What is this demographic dividend? The demographic dividend is nothing but that the age group that we have, the maximum age group of people, that is 15 to 59, who are in the working group. Now, see, the basically what happened was that since the peninsular state responded very well, this peninsular state actually responded very well when compared to the Hindi heartland. So what happened today is that this peninsular state has more elderly population. On the other hand, the demographic dividend that we are talking about is basically being witnessed where? In the Hindi heartland. So what actually today is happening is that, let us say in the COVID situation, what we are seeing is that most people that is who are coming from the Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, they are all moving back to the states such as the UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, West Bengal. Now these are the states which are the more populous states. These states are actually providing population or the worker to the southern states. I hope you understood that the demographic dividend that we are witnessing will not be in the whole of India but only in the northern belt. And from here we are supplying the workers. Next, let's move on to the Chinese antinatalism. Now, basically, we have already talked about the Chinese antinatalism in our demographic transition theory. What actually happened was that China, see, in the in the demographic transition theory, we had 5 phases. But what China did was that China went from the first phase to second phase. It jumped from the third phase and directly landed at the fourth phase. See, prior to this, I had talked about the Mao's policy. What was Mao policy? Mao policy was that let's explode our population because population was strength. But when overpopulation became a burden, China implemented its one child policy. Now let us analyze this entire note. China forms the youngest example of an anti-natalist demographic orientation, marking its beginning from 1982. Following the Maoist population policy that is pro-natalism, China started its Maoist policy of pro-natalism since 1950. China multiplied the population to become the most populous country in the world immediately after the attainment of independence. First off, based on the realization of the consumption of the economic benefit with the ever-increasing population, China molded its Maoist population policy to anti-natalism with amendment of the constitution, making one child per family a compulsion. Understand this. China amended its constitution and made that one child is compulsory to be followed. In just 20 years of its implementation, China attended zero population growth. What is this zero population growth? Zero population growth is nothing but that when your birth rate plus your immigration plus birth rate is equals to the death rate plus immigration. Immigration means coming into your country, immigration means going out of your country. Death rate and birth rate, you know. So it's immigration and the birth rate equals to the death rate and immigration. This is what I call as the zero population growth. How? In the year 2000, this cascading success was attributed to the fact that in implementation of the antinatalism policy, there was number one, complete termination of individuals' independence in deciding the time and size of the family. What China did was that every individual, whoever he may be, they had the no right to decide the time and size of the family. At what time you're going to give the birth, it's also going to be decided by the government. What will be your size of the family? Again, that would also be decided by the government. Second, efficient network of primary healthcare centers and healthcare at monitoring network. This monitoring network was basically developed to see whether people are actually following or violating. Again, in case the people were violating, then what happened was that series of economic sanctions for the individual and the family facilitate the success. What was that? That series of economic sanctions were imposed on them. What were these economic sanctions? For example, that pension was denied. For example, health welfare activities that the other people were part of were completely denied to the people who had more than one child. Now, what actually happened? Now, success of this Chinese antinatalism also generated a wide range of criticism, both economic and ethnic ground. Economically, there is huge projection scarcity of the workforce in China. You can simply write that economically, the China is suffering a scarcity of the workforce. Ethnically, what happened was that minorities such as the Tibetan, this Tibetan always they discarded to accept this rigid clause. The Tibetan basically they discarded that we won't accept Chinese antinatalism, and there was also the civil protest. Recently in the news, if you have seen that the Tibetan Prime Minister in exile had given his interview against the China recently, and this was covered by some of the Indian media. You can watch this over the YouTube. Now, in addition to China, has also evolved the poorest sex ratio. This was another big major thing. That that it was because of this that China, what it did was that it had a very poor sex ratio. Let us see, it was 926, way below India's 940. As a result of this, even if you would have recently seen the news, then brides from Pakistan are being supplied to China and they are being sold. Actually, what is happening is that there is a consistent trafficking of the girls that has been taking place from Pakistan to China. Again, in the year 2000, therefore, China slightly molded its antinatalism policy by permitting the ethnic minority, who were the ethnic minority, the Tibetans, to have two children. But still, then this did not work. Recently, what happened was that China government has completely terminated this one-child policy because of the rising elderly population, number one, and that will reach 500 million by 2050. Now China has realized this, and now only it has said that we will no more implement this one child policy. Now, despite of this, Chinese population has been increasing at a rate of 5% per decade only, as per the 2010 to 11 UN population table. You can add this over here. Now, let us understand this India and the Chinese antinatalism. In India, see, you have a grandmother, you have a grandfather, there would be a mother, grandmother, grandfather, there would be a child, that is your male child, female child, they can marry and they can have two children. But in the Chinese case, it's completely opposite. Only one child. Now, I hope this is completely clear. In the next, we'll be going for the population increasing policies or the pro-natalist policies. Thank you. That will be all for today's class.